This episode is brought to you by the new true crime docuseries American Nightmare, only on Netflix. In 2015, the Vallejo, California Police Department received a strange phone call about a kidnapping. But when the truth is stranger than fiction, you won't know who to trust or what is real. A fast-paced true crime thriller with cliffhangers at every turn. Watch American Nightmare now, only on Netflix.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi everyone, it's Briana Whitney, host of the True Crime Arizona podcast, and this is the first of several special episodes that we're going to be doing on the Zombie Hunter trial. It's a trial that is currently going on for Bryan Patrick Miller.
And I am Morgan Loew, investigative reporter here at CBS 5, 3TV, and azfamily.com. Over the next 2 months, we're going to bring you the headlines from this trial and take a closer look at all of the big developments that unfold as the trial takes place.
And if the Zombie Hunter sounds familiar to you, it's because we focused on this case extensively for a full season, episodes 1 through 10, on this podcast last year. So if you haven't gotten a chance to listen to that season, go back. You can listen to everything that's led up to this trial that has spanned over 30 years that's gotten us to this point, because the trial has just begun Monday, October 3rd.
Yeah, Briana, and just a quick note of some self-praise here. Our Zombie Hunter podcast won the 2022 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award, which is great recognition for this piece of journalism for our whole team, which includes a lot of people aside from just Briana and myself.
And it's an honor to be able to even talk about these cases, to talk to those who are involved, victims, detectives, people who are finally wanting to speak about what happened and how they were involved. So we're really thankful for everybody who listens to these episodes and puts their support into True Crime Arizona and for what we do. But why don't we start with some background of this case? Morgan, this started almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, November of 1992 was when police discovered Angela Brasso's body near a trail at I-17 in Cactus. A gruesome murder scene. She had been stabbed. She was decapitated. Her body was unclothed and a little bit away from a bike trail. And the nature of that happening on a bike trail where people could have seen it really affected this city.
I mean, people were out there biking, running, walking all the time. This was a popular place to be on that trail biking. And she was doing this in the evening. It wasn't like it was super late at night or very early in the morning. I mean, people were out. And I think that made this that much scarier.
Yeah, a lot of people out, a lot of people who could have seen it, but nobody did see this happening. And so police followed leads. They talked to people who were in the area for months and nothing. And then September of 1993, Melanie Bernis disappears and her body is found the next morning along the Arizona Canal, maybe a mile away from where this happened to Angela Brasso. And Melanie Bernis, similar nature, a knife was used on her. Her body was found without clothes on the side of the trail, and investigators immediately knew that this was the same person who did it. They just didn't know who that person was.
That's because the same DNA was found at both scenes on both girls' bodies, correct?
Right, and in the early 1990s, they could match DNA to somebody if they had the sample from the person and then the sample from whatever evidence was there. But they don't have DNA from everybody in the country. So
Sure.
at that point in time, they really were limited to people who had been incarcerated before. If you went to prison, you had to give a DNA sample.
Right.
So they used crime scene samples to try to tack it to somebody who was in prison. And this killer had not been in prison. This killer's DNA was not in the system. So they had this DNA, they just didn't know who it belonged to. And again here, no witnesses. They followed leads. Because of the way the women were attacked with a knife, they suspected maybe it was a surgeon. Maybe it was somebody who was a special forces operative who was flying into Luke Air Force Base and doing this on the weekends when he was here. But they followed these leads and they all led nowhere. And
For years.
yeah, decades went by until
DNA plays another part in this story. But so many years later, when that DNA technology had advanced, and then we're talking about genealogy, genetic genealogy, which you've probably heard a lot about in the last maybe 5 to 7 years. If you know Ancestry.com or Family Tree, a lot of people will submit their DNA just to find out if they have other relatives who they might be connected to, related to, 6 cousins out there, and their familial lineage, so to speak. But could you use that to solve a crime? That was something that was relatively new about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And so you have a genetic genealogist who was actually in town in Phoenix for a human remains symposium. Was in the convention center downtown, meet some Phoenix police officers, and they just start talking about how genetic genealogy could be used to solve crimes. And these detectives say, hey, we've got these unsolved canal murders. They are a huge cold case within our department. These crimes rock the community. Would you just give that DNA a look? Maybe you can find some connection. And she says, okay. And the genealogist is Colleen Fitzpatrick, who becomes a big player in this case. Mm-hmm. Fast forward months later, and she gets a match to the name Miller. Now, common name, right? Anybody could be Miller. And when you're talking Phoenix, Arizona, and this was in 2015 or 2014 when they were doing the testing, 2015 when there was an arrest that was made, the beginning of the year. I mean, gosh, how many Millers could be living in Phoenix or the Phoenix area in 2015?
Right.
But there were 6 markers of the name Miller that it matched. And she went to the police and said, does Miller ring a bell? And turns out that they had a man named Bryan Patrick Miller in their files for this case, somebody that they looked at. Now, there were about 200 suspects or possible persons of interest at that time. He was in this file, but it was certainly not narrowed down. Once she gave him that name, they started this kind of undercover mission to try to get his DNA from a cup at a restaurant, and it came back a match to the DNA that was at the Canal Murders scene. And that's how they were able to make the arrest of Bryan Patrick Miller so many years later. And by 2015, Bryan Patrick Miller was quite the community character.
Yeah, he was a known figure in Phoenix. And I was just listening to some of those interviews, in that interview that you did, Briana, with Colleen Fitzpatrick. And it was interesting that apparently 6 of Bryan Patrick Miller's distant relatives had submitted DNA samples to these genealogy companies.
Yes.
Looking for ancestors. And because of that, they were able to make this arrest. It's sort of mind-boggling. But as you said, Miller was a character here in Phoenix. People didn't know him as, oh, that's Bryan Patrick Miller. How they knew him was, oh, that's the zombie hunter.
And you hear that and you're like, what?
Yeah. He drove around Phoenix and would show up at these sort of Comic-Cons and sci-fi conventions with an old police cruiser with the words zombie hunter on the back. The back seat of the cruiser had a mannequin of a zombie in it, and he would dress up in this, what they call steampunk, this sort of future past sort of I'm a zombie hunter, I'm a zombie killer costume. And people took pictures with him. Police officers took pictures with him. People who were in Phoenix knew who he was. The year before he got arrested, I was driving down 7th Avenue and I see the zombie hunter vehicle drive by, and I remember looking, hey, that's the zombie hunter. And then it turns out he is an accused serial killer in real life. I mean, sometimes fact is greater than fiction. Sometimes it is more unbelievable than fiction. So he was not hiding in the shadows all
Not
this
at
time.
all.
He was out there. So, that's why we call this the zombie hunter case, and that's why he is known as the zombie hunter.
And we think that was a character he developed, in the 2010 to 2015 range. We don't believe he was the zombie hunter in the 90s when these crimes were committed. But we don't know exactly what all he was doing at that time. There is high probability that there are other victims, either sexual assault, anything like that, and then other murders that may be linked to him. And that's been a very ominous road to go down in terms of the research that you and I have done, spanning not just here in Arizona, but up to Washington State, a trail of violence, so to speak.
Yeah, everywhere he went, women were attacked. So police believe he attacked more women, but he is only charged in this case in the Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis murders. And that's this trial that is now starting. It's pretty interesting to talk to people who knew Bryan Patrick Miller before he was arrested. And we spoke to one of his friends, in fact, somebody that Miller spent Christmas Day with 2.5 weeks before he was arrested.
Wow.
So he spends Christmas Day with this guy who I talked to named Eric Braverman. And then 2.5 weeks later, he's arrested. And so we had a long conversation. We obviously taped it because we have it in some news stories. But we want to play a segment of that for you now. And the first part of it, Eric is talking about why he thinks Bryan Miller drove around in the zombie hunter mobile.
He would keep a corpse-like mannequin in there.
What do you think he got out of driving that around?
Ego building, wanting a way to say, look at me, without doing that with his personality. He liked the adulation it brought and the attention without having to say anything.
What do you think made him tick? What do you think made him do what he did?
Damage. Previous damage. Something happened at birth, something happened genetically, things done to him. There was something with women, you didn't see him using the car to go, hey ladies, take a picture of me. He's doing that with the police. So there's something with the ladies he didn't like or not comfortable with.
Did he ever come across as somebody who had that just knowledge of how to use a knife?
I would think of him as the worst candidate for special forces in the world. If he was using that kind of precision, he learned it through books or some types of videos. He had to self-train him because I don't know if he could have mustered up a push-up.
So this is the second one of Miller's friends who I've asked if Miller had any particular skill with a knife, because the killer, Brasso's killer and Bernis's killer, used a knife very skillfully. Police have not released all the details about what happened to the bodies, but they do know that whoever used the knife knew how to kill somebody fairly quickly. And so that's why they were looking for a special forces person. And every time, and both times I've asked the friends, do you think that he had any particular skill with a knife? Their answer was very similar. No way. Not this guy. He did not come off like the kind of guy who could do what the killer of the Canal murder victims did. And I think that that's just interesting. If Miller is the killer, he had a side to him that his friends didn't know about. Obviously, they didn't know he was a killer, but they didn't know that he had this sort of skill that a killer like that would have.
And he was socially awkward. Social settings were not his forte. And in our research of everything, I feel like he only shared so much with friends, with people. He was part of these kind of fantastical groups and the Renaissance Festival and fantasy festivals and things like that. And that was his group of friends. But we learned so much more in our research that I'm not sure those friends even knew. So is it possible he had that other side to him, a side that was much more violent than his friends ever thought or knew of? It's certainly possible.
Yeah, and that is something that is going to come up at trial. So let's talk a little bit about this trial. There are a couple of differences between this trial and what most people are used to seeing at trial. And the first difference is there's not going to be a jury.
Which is odd. And when we did this Zombie Hunter season last year, we didn't know that was going to be the case. That's something that's come up in this time frame as we've led up to trial. Why would there not be a jury? Is that a benefit to Bryan Patrick Miller and his defense, or is that a benefit to the prosecution?
Yeah, I've asked this question to a number of attorneys. So it would have been Bryan Miller's attorneys who would have made this decision. They made the decision that it was more in his interest to not have a jury, to just have a judge listen to the facts of the case. So these are a couple of the explanations that I've received. One is that the defense attorneys got a feeling that this judge may be more sympathetic to their defense in all of these pretrial motions. That was one opinion that I got. The other opinion, which I have received from several lawyers, is that his attorneys just did not think that a jury was going to be sympathetic to their client, that their best chance at saving his life were to have a judge, any judge, look at the facts of the case and weigh those facts without the emotion involved that a jury would, have.
Is that something a judge usually grants? I mean, every high-profile murder case I've covered, there's always been a jury. I've not seen a bench trial like this, especially for such a well-known case.
Yeah, so it's not the judge's decision. It's the defendant's decision. Wow. The defendant can forfeit the right to be tried by a jury of his or her peers. And so this was all their decision, their calculated plan. And that leads into the next point that we want to talk about here is what plan is that the defense is planning here. As we've talked about before, so much of this case, so much of the paperwork that has been submitted to court has been submitted under seal. So we haven't seen a ton of that, but we have been to a couple of the pretrial hearings, especially lately as the trial has become closer. And one of the phrases that we hear more and more now is not guilty by reason of insanity. And it appears that is going to be the defense's big push, is maybe not to say our client is innocent, but maybe that he is not guilty by reason of insanity. Briana, you've talked to some lawyers before about what that could mean. And, we hear that phrase thrown around a lot, but we don't actually see it in a ton of trials.
Yeah. So when I talk to a couple attorneys on this, criminal defense attorneys who know how this goes, this is a really interesting aspect of this case. For one thing, just proving that somebody was insane at the time of the crimes is no easy feat. Just because they commit the crimes does not mean they're deemed insane. And so that will be up to the defense to prove that he was medically and mentally insane at the time.
30 years ago.
I mean, and that's a long time. I think time in this case too plays a part. People forget things change over that amount of time. So to prove something like that 30 years ago will definitely be a feat for the defense team. But beyond just proving that he's insane, let's say he is found not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense attorney I was talking to said that because these crimes were committed in the 90s, the consequences, so to speak, that were in place in the 90s will also be what happens in this trial because those crimes were committed in 92 and 93. And he was telling me that means there's a chance that if he were to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, he could go to a mental institution, a mental health facility, serve his time there. But often, with what was in place in the 90s, every 6 months, they would reevaluate this person. And if they were deemed not insane or able to be fit for society, they could be let go. So is there a chance he's found not guilty by reason of insanity? That could change the game on whether he'd spend his life behind bars. We just don't really know that yet. But that factor is so interesting when you're talking about what was in place for consequences in the 90s versus what was in place or is in place for consequences in 2022.
Yeah, and it's almost unfathomable to think that it is possible in this trial that the defense will admit that he did it and that he could still potentially be freed in 6 months, a year and a half. Now, the odds of that happening probably fairly slim.
Sure.
But that is one of the possibilities that's out there. And it will also be interesting because these crimes occurred way back then. The test for what legal insanity was different back then than it is now. Now, one of the prongs here in Arizona is that the killer did not understand that what he or she was doing was wrong. They couldn't sort of digest the fact that this is wrong. And that makes Arizona a little different from most other states. But we're going to get all those rules as the trial starts. They're not going to have, jury instructions, but the judge is going to be pretty transparent about what the standard is that she is using in this case. Now, a couple of odds and ends about this trial coming up. Because it's not a jury trial, it's not going to be really compressed. In fact, the trial is going to span a couple of months, but it's not going to be like their trial proceedings every day, all day. It starts at 10:30 in the morning. I think it's going to be done at 4:30 in the afternoon. They're not having court on Fridays. And then 2 weeks into the trial, they're taking a 2-week break because one of the attorneys had a vacation or something like that. And normally, if there's a jury, they want to get it done as quickly as possible because these jurors are being pulled out of their lives.
Sure.
And this is just the judge. And the judge has said in one of these pretrial proceedings, there may be a day where we only take testimony for 2 hours, or we may not have testimony on one day if she thinks that she needs to digest the information that's come in.
Because she's the only one making the decision here.
Yeah.
It's up to one person and one person only, which is so different than what we're used to.
Yeah, and in addition to that, the pretrial proceedings have shown that there's a lot of legal wrangling about who is going to be able to testify about Bryan Miller's state of mind, what witnesses they're going to allow, and they're also wrangling over what mental health professionals they're going to allow, what they're going to allow them to say at trial. And it's been pretty fascinating listening to that, but it also sort of tells me that there may be a lot of days of testimony from a psychiatrist or psychologist who is testifying about some really complicated mental health science. And it may be a little hard to digest for, those of us, myself included, who don't really understand all of that.
Right.
We'll have to see how that trial goes, but we will have a camera in the courtroom. Cameras are allowed in the courtroom. We're going to be covering it. The trial every day, just about every day. We'll know what's going on, and we're going to be doing television news stories, web stories, and we're also going to bring you these podcasts.
Yeah, and we're hoping to do these weekly. It just kind of depends on like what Morgan was saying, what days they have the court trial that week and how long they go, and then that break. But for all of your updated Zombie Hunter trial coverage, information, the latest testimony, you'll want to be right here on the True Crime Arizona podcast. We'll be breaking it down each week and also just kind of explaining it in layman's terms too. Sometimes you can get that kind of court talk. It can be a little bit confusing, but in the end, this is a pretty crazy case that Morgan and I have done so much research on, and we want to make sure that everything that we brought to you guys last year in the case will now have that final end chapter, that closure, the end of the case that so many people that have been involved in this have waited nearly 3 decades for.
Yeah, and as this trial goes on, there will be people who have been involved in this case who are going to do interviews with us. So it may be when the trial's over, it may be after they've testified, but we are going to have new interviews that we're going to be bringing you throughout, as well as the sort of updates on what's happening news-wise with that trial.
And those are people who weren't able to talk to us. These are people we've been in contact with, have created relationships, connections with, but these are people who are not able to talk about this case until the trial has ended. So there is going to be a whole lot more to come, a lot more details, and of course we'll have everything there. The best way to stay on top of the developments is, of course, to subscribe to True Crime Arizona if you haven't already. That way you'll get notified when a new episode is available on the feed, and we'll be bringing them to you as often as we can, right on top of the Zombie Hunter trial as it unfolds in front of us too.
All right, so long, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Briana Whitney.
And me, Morgan Loew. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.